By April of 1913, as the Imperator was nearing completion, it underwent its builder's trials to ensure the propulsion machinery worked as intended, and the ship would also be examined to receive a series of certificates that would legally allow it to begin its career as a transatlantic passenger liner. This was a vital part of the ship's construction, as, for the first time in German maritime history, a large ocean liner was going to mount turbine machinery consisting of 4 sets of Curtiss AEG Vulcan steam turbines, producing 62,000 shaft horsepower ahead and 35,000 astern. The trials went according to plan, without a hitch, and the ship began receiving its first certificates, and by the 23rd of May 1913, the ship was completed and officially handed over to the Hamburg America line as it was finally ready for service. Unfortunately for Hamburg America, the day the ship left the builder's yard, it began to have problems, as, due to its 36-foot draft being the deepest to ever enter the Elbe River as the ship was transferring down the river in order to reach Cuxhaven, it ran aground on accident. Luckily, the ship was pulled off within a timely manner, and upon inspection of the hull, there were no leaks and no visible signs of damage. But the ship's problems didn't end here, as, once it arrived at Cuxhaven in order to prepare for its maiden voyage, which was scheduled to start the next day on the 24th of May, an explosion occurred in one of its boiler rooms, which, depending on what report you read, upwards of 5 crewmen were killed. Hamburg America was quick to blame the carelessness of workmen at Cuxhaven preparing the ship for its maiden voyage, but there has never really been a defined answer as to why this explosion occurred. What we do know is that the explosion resulted in a 2-week delay in the ship's maiden voyage, so instead of beginning on the 24th of May as intended, it was rescheduled to the 10th of June, which was a great embarrassment for Hamburg America since this was the first ship to surpass 50,000 gross tons, and it was the premier liner that they had been advertising for the last few years. Not to mention that the project that would create the 3 Imperator-class ocean liners was fully and publicly supported by the Kaiser himself. By the 10th of June, necessary repairs were completed, and the vessel would depart Cuxhaven under the command of Captain Hans Russer, whom was also the Commodore of the Hamburg America line and the projected commander of Vaterland and Bismarck once they were ready for service. The ship would then head off to Southampton in order to collect passengers, and then it would backtrack to Cherbourg, where it would collect more passengers, and then from there, its maiden voyage would officially begin on the 11th of June. The site of the Imperator was one worth mentioning, as Bernard Walker, who would write an article within the Scientific American, would board the ship for its maiden voyage, and he wrote the following. At the first sight of such a ship, one fails to grasp its magnitude. The first thing that strikes the visitor is the unusual height between decks, which in the case of several is from 11 to 12 feet. If the ship were to be placed in Broadway, it would be necessary to cut 18 feet beyond the building line on each side of that thoroughfare for a length of 4 city blocks, and the roofs of the topmost tier of staterooms and assembly halls would extend far above the roof line of the 6- and 7-story buildings erected in the pre-skyscraper period. Upon departing Cherbourg, Imperator had a total of 3,014 passengers on board, 323 in first class. Amongst these was Albert Ballin, whom was the managing director of Hamburg America, and was also the one who came up with the idea to create the 3 Imperator-class ocean liners. There were also 251 second-class passengers and 2,440 third and steerage-class passengers. The maiden voyage began smoothly. No issues as far as I can find were reported until the 13th of June, 2 days into the voyage, when the ship entered slightly choppy waters, and it naturally began to roll. This is when the most known weakness of the Imperator was first discovered, as the ship's roll was prolonged, which began to make passengers nervous, and once the ship had exited the choppy waters and stopped rolling, it retained a 2-degree list to port. As the voyage continued and Imperator began to use up its supplies, whether this be coal, water, or food, and its draft began to lighten, the list became slightly more noticeable. The maiden voyage would take a total of 6 days, 5 hours, and 12 minutes to complete, which, given the time period, this was extraordinary. Imperator proved that it was capable of 24.5 knots, and it could sustain a cruising speed of 23 to 23.5 knots, making it the third fastest ship in the world, behind Mauretania and Lusitania. Upon arriving at New York, Hamburg America had hired Brown and Dawson, which was a photography company, to photograph the arrival of the ship for publicity reasons. The actions of the ship's arrival at New York are worth going into more detail, as more information regarding the ship's list became apparent. Captain George Seath would board Imperator in order to assist in guiding it to its moorings, and as the vessel needed to make a turn into Ambrose Channel, he ordered easy right rudder, and the ship began to straighten up, and then its port list turned into a starboard list. Seath would later recall that loose furnishings would fall over and passengers would lose footing and trip. However, this story does not seem very likely, as I've never been able to find anything else to back up that claim, and the Imperator's listing issue was a slow process, and it wasn't that extreme. Even with the listing issue becoming more apparent, the vessel would dock with ease, entering Pier 1 at Hoboken with the assistance of 11 tugs. All in all, the Imperator's maiden voyage was a massive success, and it was reported that both Albert Bollin and Hans Russer were delighted with the reception they received by the mass crowds at New York. The Hamburg America House magazine would state, "Nothing could diminish the general feeling of gladness, which indeed among the Americans was so hearty and unrestrained that it rose to almost frenzied, jubilant applause." All of that being said, the Imperator's arrival at New York was not fully worth celebrating, as upon mooring, the ship caught on fire. The fire would occur within passenger accommodations at the stern of the ship, in the vicinity of one of the D-deck hatches. In this photograph, most people tend to point out that Imperator has a slight list to starboard, which is true. However, what's more interesting is if you look down at the pier on the starboard side of the ship, you can see men pulling out a fire hose in order to combat the fire. Shortly after the fire began, fireboats arrived on the scene and sent their hoses through the port side portholes within the vicinity of the flames, and water began getting pumped into the ship at an extreme rate. However, it was not exiting the ship, and so the slight list to starboard began to increase as water built up. After a couple of hours, the Imperator's list to starboard became dangerous, and it was ordered that all firefighter operations come to a halt, but luckily by that point, the flames were out and the ship was safe. As a result of both its jubilant reception and the near-career-ending fire, Imperator found itself on the first page of many newspapers, but luckily this did not diminish the ship's prestige, and for its first eastbound crossing, it would have a total of 2,332 passengers. 704 were in first class, and 1,095 were in second, third, and steerage total, which, while being less than half of what had traveled initially, going back to Europe, it was expected that the ship would carry less. What's even more damning is that for the ship's second westbound voyage, it carried a total of 3,646 passengers, which was the largest passenger record the ship would ever hold, whether this is pre- or post-World War I. As a matter of fact, it remains one of the largest peacetime passenger manifest out of any ocean liner. Another note worth making is that upon arriving at New York on the 17th of September, it was recorded that 859 first-class passengers disembarked the ship, which made it the largest first-class passenger manifest Imperator would ever hold, and it actually remains one of the largest first-class passenger manifests to ever enter New York. Unfortunately, it seems most likely that during this voyage, the well-known eagle on Imperator's bow had its wings clipped by the seas, and with one of its most prominent features being damaged, it had to be removed, and it would eventually be replaced by iron gilding, which was of an iron scroll design that would be applied to the Vaterland. Imperator would then return to Europe without mishap, and in October of 1913, the ship was sent back to the Vulcan shipyard for a major refit in order to address the listing problem. Firstly, the funnels are one of the most known features that were altered. Initially, it is believed that Imperator's funnels were 82 feet tall, and it is commonly stated that 9 feet were cut off. However, if that's true, then they would be 73 feet tall rather than the commonly claimed 69 feet tall, so it's most likely that actually 13 feet were cut off the top of the funnels. As far as most people are concerned, this alteration made the funnels look more proportionate to the ship, which is what made it so noticeable. At the after end of the B deck, Imperator had a grill room, which was very noticeable when it was installed. However, during this refit, it was decided that this room would be removed entirely, which altered the appearance of the after superstructure. A lot of the ship's heavy furnishings in the upper decks of the vessel were also removed and replaced with high-quality but lightweight counterparts. The last major alteration, as far as anyone would be concerned, was invisible, as 2,000 tons of cement would be poured into the ship's double bottom to act as permanent ballast, so that as Imperator used up its provisions during a voyage, it still had mass in the bottom of the ship. Combine this with all the features that were moved up top to make it light on the top, and the ship's stability issue had been solved. In modern-day terms, most people still claim that Imperator was plagued with listing throughout its entire life. However, this is factually false. In reality, upon examining photographs of the ship after these alterations were made, it is almost always on an even keel, unless it is being loaded or its trim tanks are being adjusted. The United States Navy also reported no issues with stability and were more than happy jam-packing troops onto the vessel during World War I voyages, and when the Cunard Line obtained the ship, they actually made alterations that added weight to the top of the vessel, such as removing all of the sea deck lifeboats and installing all of them on the boat deck. This would impact the ship's center of gravity, but even after doing this, Cunard reported no issues with stability. The reason I'm pointing out the stability misconception so much is because there has always been a claim made that in order to correct the issue, Imperator should have been designed with one less deck than it originally was. And when I tried to find a source for this, Wikipedia was the only place I found that claim, and there was no reference. Couple that complication with the fact that I've never found a source from Hamburg America, the United States Navy, or the Cunard Line that ever mentioned that suggestion, and since it was never done on the sideline, and the fact that Cunard made alterations that added weight back to the top of the ship, it made me realize that that claim was completely bogus. Moving on from the stability issue, Imperator's career for the remainder of 1913 and throughout 1914 would continue successfully, with the ship averaging around 3,000 passengers per voyage. It appeared that Hamburg America's great risk on building these three ocean liners was well worth taking, and they were getting a nice profit. However, the First World War would put this to an end, as Imperator would be laid up in Germany, the Vaterland would be confiscated by the United States government, and Bismarck would lay up incomplete. When all was said and done, by the 1920s, all three ships were under the operation and ownership of Allied companies, and the three vessels would never operate together as intended. However, their World War I years and post-World War I careers are stories for different days. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.